What's the difference between a documentary and an ethnographic film? Well, the anthropologist Peter Loizos argues that ethnographic films are a form of documentary filmmaking. So to better understand ethnographic films, we have to first define and understand documentaries. What is a documentary? To be fair, you probably know intuitively when a film is made in a documentary mode. Looking at some of the most influential documentary films made over the last 20 years, they're all films about something that actually happened. They concentrate on historical topics like biographies or broader social justice movements and real-world conflicts. They also provide an outlet for societal critique and criticism. Using techniques like interviews and guerrilla filmmaking, documentaries focus on the lives of real people as opposed to fictional characters. And because of that, documentaries tend to feature real people representing themselves for the camera, as opposed to actors playing the role of somebody else. These are Bill Nichols' so-called 3 common-sense assumptions about documentary film. When a film displays these characteristics, it's easy for people to identify it as documentary, but curiously, academic film historians have often struggled to articulate a single shared definition that characterizes the genre as a whole. If you look it up online, you'll probably find some form of John Grierson's definition of documentary as the creative treatment of actuality from the 1930s, which is still used today. But Grierson's definition is also famously problematic. Nichols argues that there's an inherent tension between the concept of creative treatment, which suggests the cinematic editing and narrativity of fiction, and the concept of actuality, which is more suggestive of the work of journalists and historians. It's also common for documentary films to be organized around a central argument, which explicitly reflects the opinions and biases of the filmmaker. This intersection of creative treatment and argumentation, with editing designed to reinforce the filmmaker's arguments regarding real-world events, separates documentaries from things like surveillance footage or animal behavior on film. In academic jargon, we might say that that type of non-documentary reality footage has a very high level of transparency or indexicality. That's just a fancy way of saying that the footage aims to reproduce exactly what happens in front of the camera with a minimal editorial voice. Where clarity and high indexicality are vital to surveillance or scientific research footage, documentary films generally have lower indexicality, and the most critically successful documentaries are often highly stylized, heavily edited, and use music to enhance the dramatic and emotional impact of scenes. For that reason, theorists like Bill Nichols often stress that documentary films aren't reproductions of reality, they are representations of reality. To paraphrase Nichols' introduction to documentary, we judge a reproduction, something like a scan, photocopy, or passport photo, based on its fidelity to the original subject. But we use different criteria in judging a representation of a subject. We judge it based on things like the value of insight it provides, the quality of its perspective, and the value that we place on its production. In that sense, stylistically, documentary films can share a great deal with fiction, and a number of filmmakers have adopted the stylistic conventions of documentary in their fictional films, using interviews, free camera filming, and historical footage to ground their subject matter in a grittier, more relatable real-world context. But what if a documentary filmmaker doesn't want to rely on stylized representation to convey information or an argument? What if their goal instead is to document cultural phenomena more objectively with a high level of indexicality, say for the purposes of social scientific research? And this is the point where documentaries can begin to be considered ethnographic films. Ethnographic filmmakers use film as a form of data collection that can supplement qualitative research and writing or be an ethnographic product in its own right. But the technical distinction between ethnographic and documentary film is far from black and white. Back in the 1970s, the anthropologist J. Ruby proposed these 4 criteria, which are often used to distinguish ethnographic films from the broader documentary genre. This isn't the only taxonomic definition of ethnographic film, but it is one that you'll frequently encounter. First, to be considered ethnographic, a film has to focus on and contextualize a whole culture or a distinct cultural practice. John Marshall's The Hunters, for example, follows a group of Johansi Bushmen on a giraffe hunt across the Kalahari Desert. We learn about giraffe hunting, but also the broader kinship systems and agricultural practices that help to define the cultures of the San peoples. So ethnographic films tend to contextualize particular beliefs and practices within a broader sociocultural context, and they don't take the form of biographies, investigative journalism, or social advocacy films. Second and third, ethnographic films must be informed by an ethnographic methodology and theoretical understanding of culture, as well as use anthropological terminology in their voiceovers or intertitles. This is the most obviously academic aspect of ethnographic filmmaking, and it immediately identifies some films as being made for social scientific researchers or students in cultural studies and anthropology. Peter Loizos calls this tendency ethnographic authentication, and this often goes beyond the actual film itself as a product. Filmmakers and anthropologists like John Marshall and Timothy Ash also wrote books that were meant to be read as supplements to their films, further contextualizing and deepening the audience's appreciation of each film as a source of ethnographic data. Which brings us to the fourth criteria. Films and filmmakers have to be explicit about their research and filming methods. From a very early stage, theorists discovered that film, as a tool for social scientific research, is incapable of providing an unmediated representation of its subject matter. The filmmaker's choice of what to shoot, when, and how all introduce potential implicit biases that can influence the audience's perception of a film's subject. This is one of the obvious strengths of film as a storytelling medium, but for the objective goals of scientific research, it poses significant problems. In an effort to deconstruct and contextualize their own potential biases, which can accidentally be reproduced in their films, ethnographic filmmakers sometimes produce extra content to articulate how and why they filmed and edited particular sequences. So in a sense, all ethnographic films are documentaries, but not all documentaries are ethnographic. They may be interesting to ethnographers in the sense that all films are cultural products, and the documentary genre is a fantastic outlet for artistic and cultural expression. But unless a film adheres to certain social scientific criteria, it's generally not considered ethnographic by visual anthropologists and film historians. And J. Ruby's criteria are far from a perfect indicator for whether or not a film is considered ethnographic. There are films that fail to meet some of these criteria that are still considered classic examples of the genre. But they give those of us interested in visual anthropology a starting point to discuss the gray area between documentary and ethnographic filmmaking and the fluidity between the two terms that you'll often encounter in academic communities. If you found that helpful, please do like and subscribe. It'll help us make more videos on social science and visual anthropology. We're also starting a Patreon page, so check that out. It's a great way to support the channel and social scientific content. And until next time, don't ever stop learning.